Her stepmother sold her bridal dress to humiliate her. Then the Duke arrived with a royal invitation. The garment bag was gone. Ilara did not scream. She did not run downstairs and demand an explanation. She stood in the doorway of her own bedroom, staring at the empty space behind her winter coats, and she felt the air leave her lungs the way it does when something truly terrible has already happened, and there is nothing left to do but accept it. The bag had been ivory white. She had kept it tucked behind the coats deliberately, pushed all the way to the back wall, hidden between a navy wool jacket and an old gray scarf. She had been careful. She had been so careful. She moved to the closet and pushed every coat aside, one by one, searching with her hands the way you search for something in the dark, even when part of you already knows it is not there. The hangers scraped and clicked. The coats swayed. The space behind them was empty. Just a bare wooden rod and a faint smell of cedar. She turned around and looked at the rest of the room. Her bed was made. The window was closed. Her small desk held the same books and the same pen holder and the same framed photograph of her father that had stood in the same spot for 3 years. Nothing else was different, only the closet, only the bag. She walked downstairs. Margareta was in the kitchen, seated at the table near the window, folding linen napkins into neat triangles the way she always did on Tuesday evenings. The kitchen smelled of boiled onions and dish soap. The radio on the counter murmured something low and indistinct. Petra and Luisa, Margareta's 2 daughters, sat at the far end of the table with their phones, not looking up. Ilara stood in the doorway. She said, "My garment bag is missing from my closet." Margareta did not look up immediately. She finished folding the napkin she held, smoothed the crease with 2 fingers, and set it down before she finally raised her eyes. "I cleared out some things," she said. Ilara felt her chest tighten. "What things?" "There was an old dress bag taking up space in the closet. I took it to the consignment shop on Brower Street." Margareta reached for another napkin. "Frau Heller gave me €180 for it." The kitchen was very quiet. Even the radio seemed to go soft. Petra scrolled through something on her phone. Luisa examined her fingernails. Neither of them looked up. Ilara said, "That was my wedding dress." Margareta unfolded the napkin and began again. "It was in the closet," she said. "I thought it was something old. You should have kept it somewhere more obvious if it was important." Ilara did not answer. She stood there for another moment, looking at the woman who had moved into her father's house 11 years ago as a second wife, and had never, not once, looked at Ilara with anything resembling warmth. Then she turned and walked back upstairs. She got her keys, her phone, and her jacket. She went to her car, which was parked at the end of the narrow driveway, and she sat in it with the engine off and her hands flat on the steering wheel. She did not cry yet. The tears would come later, in the shower, where nobody would hear them. Right now she just sat with the stillness that comes after a blow lands. The dress had cost her 11 months of careful saving. She worked as a florist at a small shop 3 streets away from the house, arranging bouquets and wreaths and bridal table centerpieces for other people's celebrations. The pay was not large. She put aside a little every week, sometimes more when she picked up extra deliveries on weekends, and she had watched the number in her savings account grow slowly, the way a plant grows, almost invisibly, until one day you notice it is taller than you expected. She had walked into the bridal boutique on a wet Tuesday in October, alone, without telling anyone. She had not wanted company. She had not wanted advice or opinions or the kind of well-meaning commentary that makes a private moment feel crowded. She had wanted to find something that was hers, chosen by her, for no reason except that it was right. The woman at the boutique, a kind person named Frau Adler, had brought out 7 dresses before Ilara saw it. It had been hanging near the back of the rack, not the most expensive, not the most dramatic. Ivory silk, not stark white. A modest neckline with hand-stitched lace that ran along the collar and down the sleeves. A silhouette that was clean and unshowy, the kind that doesn't try too hard. She had looked at it for a long time before asking to try it on. In the fitting room, she had put it on by herself and turned to face the mirror, and something had happened that she had not expected. She had stood very still and looked at herself and felt, for the first time in a long time, like a whole person, not a tenant in her own house. Not a girl whose father died and left her in a home that no longer felt safe. Not the quiet one who got up early and stayed out late and tried to take up as little space as possible. Just herself, complete, standing in a dress that fit her as though it had been made for her measurements. She had not told anyone about that moment, not even Nadia, her best friend, who knew almost everything. Some things are too true to say out loud right away. You have to carry them quietly for a while first. She bought the dress that same day. She carried it home in its white garment bag with the gold zipper, and she hid it behind her coats because she knew, without having to think about it very hard, that it was not safe to leave it anywhere visible. This was not paranoia. This was 11 years of lived experience in a house where her things had a way of disappearing, being damaged, being borrowed without permission and returned broken or not at all. She had been careful. She had been so careful. Now she sat in the car in the dark and thought about the fact that the wedding was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks. She and Owen had been engaged for 14 months. Owen Hartley was a school teacher who taught mathematics to 12-year-olds with a patience and gentleness that still amazed her. He had proposed under the chestnut tree at the end of Burgas Street on a Sunday afternoon in March, kneeling in the wet grass with his grandmother's ring and a slightly panicked expression that made her love him more than she had ever loved anyone. He was going to be her family, the real kind, the chosen kind. She picked up her phone and called him. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and a little tired. He had been marking papers, she could tell. She told him what had happened. There was a silence on his end. Then he said, "I'm coming over." She said, "You don't need to." He said, "I know I don't need to." She told him to stay, that she was all right, that she would figure it out. He stayed on the phone for a long time, not saying much, just being there, which was the thing she loved most about him. He understood that sometimes presence is the only useful thing. After she hung up, she sat for another few minutes and thought. She could go to the consignment shop first thing tomorrow morning. It was possible the dress was still there. People didn't always sell things the same day they were dropped off. There was a chance, a real one, that the dress was still hanging on a rack behind a glass door on Brower Street, waiting. She held on to that thought. It was small and uncertain, but it was something. She had grown up in Vienna, not in a beautiful, prosperous part of the city, but in the Eastern District where the streets were narrower and the buildings had a worn, practical look, and the parks were not as tended as the ones tourists visited. Her father, Gerhard Voss, had worked as an accountant for a mid-sized import company. He was a quiet man with a gentle humor and a habit of folding newspaper corners to mark the articles he wanted to read later. He had raised Ilara alone from the time she was 9, after her mother left to take up a new life somewhere further west. He had done it without complaint, making lunches and attending school concerts and asking, every evening at dinner, what was the best thing that happened to her that day. She had loved him in the simple, complete way that children love parents who show up. She had not known, when she was a child, that this was not something everyone had. She understood it later, when she was older, and had seen how other families worked. Her father was not a perfect man. He was sometimes distracted and occasionally too trusting, and he made the significant error of marrying Margareta when Ilara was 15. Margareta came with 2 daughters of her own, Petra, who was 17, and Louisa, who was 14. They moved into the house on Weissgasse Street that Ilara and her father had shared for years, and almost immediately the atmosphere of the house changed. It became colder and more formal. There were now rules about the kitchen and the sitting room. There were conversations Ilara was not included in. There were small remarks delivered in front of her father that he did not quite catch because he was trusting by nature and not built for reading cruelty in soft voices. Ilara had spent years trying to tell herself that Margareta simply had a different personality, a different way of showing warmth, that the distance was not intentional. She had spent years trying to be fair, but 11 years is a long time, and by the time her father died of a heart attack 3 years ago at the age of 61, Ilara had stopped trying to explain it to herself. Some things simply are what they are. Her father had left the house to Ilara. This was in his will, clearly stated. Margareta had the right to remain in residence for a period of 2 years, a clause her father had included out of consideration. The 2 years had passed, but Ilara had not yet moved to enforce the will because her father's solicitor had retired and she had not found the energy or the money to engage a new one, and because some part of her still flinched from the confrontation. This was something Nadia pointed out regularly with increasing directness. Tomorrow, she told herself, sitting in the car outside the house on Weissgasse Street. Tomorrow she would go to Brower Street. She would find the dress. She would bring it home. And then, very soon, she would begin making other changes too. She got out of the car and went back inside. Margareta was still at the kitchen table. The napkins were stacked and folded. She was reading something now, a magazine held open with both hands, and she did not look up when Ilara passed through. Ilara went upstairs. She made herself tea. She sat on the edge of her bed with the mug between her palms, and looked at the space on her mirror where she had taped a small photograph from the boutique, a photo Frau Adler had taken for her on the day she bought the dress. A snapshot of Ilara standing in the fitting room smiling at herself. She still had the photo. At least she still had that. She drank the tea slowly and thought about Owen and the chestnut tree and the wet grass and his panicked expression. And she thought about the way the silk of the dress had felt under her fingers when she first touched it. She thought about the wedding. 6 weeks. She thought about the life that was waiting for her on the other side of all of this. Then she turned off the light and lay down in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, its familiar creaks and silences, and she told herself the only thing she could honestly tell herself that night. Tomorrow she would try. She woke before 5, as she always did on workdays. The shop opened at 7 and she liked to be there early, when the delivery crates of fresh flowers arrived, still damp and cool, smelling of water and green stems. There was something deeply satisfying about the first hour of the day at the shop, before customers, before conversation, when it was just her and the flowers and the clean, quiet work of arranging. She dressed without turning on the main light, moving through the familiar dark of her room by memory, avoiding the loose board near the wardrobe out of long practice. She made coffee downstairs in the kitchen, which was empty and still at this hour, and she drank it standing at the counter looking out at the street below, where the sky was just beginning to go from black to the deep, bruised blue of very early morning. She thought about the dress again. She had thought about it most of the night. The consignment shop on Brower Street did not open until 9. She calculated that she could arrive at work by 6:30, get through the morning arrangements, hand the first deliveries to her assistant, and be at the shop by 9:15. It was a thin plan, but it was a plan, and having it helped. She rinsed her mug, she put on her jacket, she picked up her bag. She paused at the foot of the stairs and looked down the hallway toward the kitchen, where Margaretti's neatly folded napkins still sat in their pile on the table, and she thought, 180 euros. That was what she had been told, 180 euros for an ivory silk dress with hand-stitched lace that Alara had saved for 11 months to buy. She pushed the front door open and stepped out into the morning. The street was cool and quiet. A cat crossed the far end of it, pausing once to look back at her. Somewhere a few blocks away a tram bell rang, clear and silver in the still air. She walked to the shop with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes down, and she tried to keep her thoughts steady. One thing at a time. The flowers first, then the dress, then everything else. The shop was called Blumenwerk, which meant flower work, and she had been employed there for 4 years. The owner, Herr Bauer, was a round, kind man in his 60s, who had built the business over 30 years, and now left most of the actual arranging to Alara because, as he told her once with great sincerity, she had a talent for it that he had never possessed himself. She took this seriously. She worked hard. The shop had a small but loyal clientele, and a growing reputation for wedding arrangements, which was where most of the good work happened. She let herself in with her key and switched on the workroom lights. The crates were already on the back step, delivered by the wholesale driver who came before dawn. She carried them in one by one, and began sorting through the flowers, clipping stems and arranging them in the tall buckets of water that lined the left wall of the workroom. Roses, freesia, white tulips, branches of eucalyptus still holding the cool of the morning. She worked steadily and without hurry, letting her hands do what they knew how to do, and for a while the familiar rhythm of the work quieted the noise in her mind. This was what she loved about it. You could not think about anything else when your hands were full of flowers and your eyes were measuring proportions and your instincts were guiding the way a stem should fall. By 8:30 she had finished the morning arrangements and set 3 completed bouquets aside for delivery. Her assistant, a young woman named Clara, arrived at 8:45, slightly breathless, with a half-eaten roll in one hand and her coat not yet buttoned. Alara told her about the deliveries. She did not explain where she was going. She took off her apron and picked up her bag and walked out into the morning, which had by now brightened into a pale, slightly clouded Tuesday. Brower Street was 12 minutes on foot. She walked quickly. Nadia had called her the previous night, just after 11, because Alara had sent her a short message that said only, she sold the dress. Nadia had called immediately, which was exactly what Nadia did when something was wrong. She was that kind of friend, the kind who does not wait to see if you meant it or were exaggerating. She called first and asked questions after. On the phone, Nadia had said words that Alara would think about for a long time. She had said, "You have been patient with that woman for 11 years, and she just sold your wedding dress for 180 euros. At some point, Alara, patience stops being a virtue and starts being a cost you can't afford." Alara had not known what to say to that, so she had said, "I know." Nadia had said, "Do you?" She had said, "I'm working on it." Now she turned onto Brower Street and saw the consignment shop ahead, its window display lit with a careful arrangement of second-hand coats and bags, and shoes that had been staged to look tasteful and deliberate. The sign in the window said open. She pushed the door. A small bell rang above her as she stepped inside. Frau Heller, the owner, was behind the counter arranging price tags on a row of scarves. She was a small woman in her 70s with neat silver hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked up when Ilara came in. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," Ilara said. "I'm looking for a dress that was brought in yesterday. An ivory silk dress, long, with hand-stitched lace at the collar and sleeves. It would have come in a white garment bag." Frau Heller's expression shifted very slightly, not with confusion, with something closer to recognition. "I remember it," she said. She paused. "I sold it yesterday afternoon." Ilara stood very still. "Yesterday afternoon?" "Yes." "A woman came in around 4 o'clock. She saw it on the rack and tried it on and bought it immediately. She paid cash. The shop was very quiet. A clock ticked somewhere near the back." "I see," Ilara said. "I'm sorry," Frau Heller said. She sounded like she meant it. "If I had known." "You couldn't have known," Ilara said. "It wasn't your fault." She asked, gently, whether the woman had left any contact details. Frau Heller shook her head, but then paused and looked at the receipt book she kept on the counter. She opened it and studied the entry from yesterday. "She paid €340, Frau Heller said. She looked up at Ilara with a careful expression. Ilara understood immediately. €340. Margareta had told her 180. The difference was €160, kept without mention. She thanked Frau Heller and walked back out into the street. She stood on the pavement with her hands at her sides and the weak morning sun on her face, and thought about what it meant to have taken even that. Not just the dress, not just the money from the sale, but the full amount, quietly pocketed, and a lesser number reported back. As though Ilara would not check. As though she was too trusting or too afraid, or simply did not matter enough to be told the truth. She stood there for a long moment. Then she took out her phone and called Owen. He answered quickly. "Did you find it?" "No," she said. "It sold yesterday afternoon, €340. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She told you 180. "Yes." A longer quiet. Then, "Ilara, you need a solicitor." "I know," she said. "Not eventually, now." She looked down Brower Street toward the intersection, where a tram slid past, bright and ordinary, full of people going to ordinary places. "I know," she said again. And this time, she meant it differently. Ilara did not speak about the dress again when she returned to the house that evening. She cooked her own dinner, cleaned her own dishes, and went upstairs without passing through any room where Margareta or her daughters were sitting. She had developed this ability over years, the ability to move through the house like a shadow, taking up no space, making no noise, existing in the margins of the building that technically belonged to her. That night she sat at her desk and wrote 2 things in the small notebook she kept in her top drawer. The first was a note to find a solicitor. The second was a short list of everything she had tolerated in this house over the past 3 years since her father died. Not out of self-pity, but because she understood now that Nadia was right. There was a cost to patience, and she had been paying it quietly for a very long time. She closed the notebook and put it away and sat in the quiet of her room. 6 weeks until the wedding. The dress was gone. But she still had Owen, she still had the date, she still had herself. And that, she told herself with a steadiness she was surprised to find she actually felt, was enough to begin. The next morning she called Nadia before work. Nadia, who worked as a nurse at a hospital across the city, and therefore kept hours that made normal people faint, was already awake, and between shifts. She listened to the full account of Frau Heller's shop, the receipt, the €160 difference, and the moment Ilara had stood on the pavement afterward. When Ilara finished, Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So what are you going to do?" Ilara said, "I'm going to find a solicitor this week, and I'm going to find a dress." Nadia made a sound of quiet satisfaction. "In that order?" "In that order," Ilara said. There was a warmth in the silence between them then, the warmth of 2 people who have been friends long enough to communicate more in the gaps between words than in the words themselves. "I'll come Saturday," Nadia said. "We'll go together." "For the dress." "You don't have to." "Stop saying that to people who love you," Nadia said. "It's annoying." Ilara smiled for the first time in 2 days. She went to work. She arranged flowers. She made a telephone call during her lunch break to a solicitor whose name had been given to her by Herr Bauer, a woman named Dr. Kunze who handled estate matters and had, according to Herr Bauer, a reputation for being direct and thorough and not fond of unnecessary delay. The receptionist told her the earliest appointment was in 4 days. Ilara took it. She told no one at the house. Owen came to the shop after work that day, as he sometimes did, and they sat together in the small back room among the buckets of flowers, while Alara finished her last arrangement of the day. He brought sandwiches and ate his while she worked, watching her hands move with the stems and the wire and the ribbon, and he did not try to fill the silence. After a while he said, "My mother has a dress." Alara looked up. "She wore it to my parents' anniversary dinner about 8 years ago. It's not a wedding dress, it's more of a formal evening gown, but it's ivory, and it's beautiful, and she said you should see it if you want." Alara looked at him for a moment. "Your mother said that?" "She heard what happened." "You told her?" "She asked why I seemed upset," he said simply. "I told her. She called it outrageous. She used the word outrageous about 3 times in the same sentence." Alara laughed, a small and genuine laugh. Owen's mother, Frances Hartley, was a compact and energetic woman in her early 60s who gardened fiercely and had opinions about everything, and had welcomed Alara from the first meeting with a warmth so uncomplicated that it had actually taken Alara a while to trust it. "I'll think about it," Alara said. "She also said you're welcome to come for dinner this weekend and try it on if you'd like." Alara set down the arrangement she had been building and looked at it. A loose cascade of white and blush flowers, greenery trailing at the edges. She tilted her head and moved one stem slightly to the left. "Better." "All right," she said. "Yes." Owen reached over and stole the remaining half of her sandwich, which she had been meaning to finish. She did not protest. She just shook her head. "You are going to be an exceptionally annoying husband," she said. "I know," he said cheerfully, "but you agreed to it." She had, and sitting there in the back of the flower shop with her hands still smelling of eucalyptus and Owen stealing her sandwich, the sadness of the past 2 days lifted, just slightly, just enough. The dress was gone, that was real and it hurt, but this, what she had with Owen, what she was building, was also real. More real actually, more permanent. She finished the arrangement. She covered the buckets. She turned off the workroom lights. They walked home in the direction of Weissgasse Street together, taking the longer route along the canal where the last light of the day was still catching the water in thin gold lines. Alara told him about the solicitor appointment. He nodded and said it was the right thing. She told him about the amount on Frau Heller's receipt, the 160 euros. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said, quietly, "That's not about money, is it?" She shook her head. "No, it never was about money." They walked in silence for a while. A pair of ducks crossed the towpath ahead of them, unimpressed by their presence. "What will you do about a dress?" he said. "Nadia is coming Saturday. We'll look." He nodded. "And if you can't find something you love?" She considered this honestly. "Then I'll get married in the nicest thing I own and you'll think I'm beautiful anyway." He looked at her sideways. "I will absolutely think you're beautiful anyway." "I know," she said. "That's why I can say it." He squeezed her hand and they walked the rest of the way without speaking, and the canal glittered beside them, and the city went on around them, its noise and its motion, and its absolute indifference to any one person's grief, which was, in its way, a comfort. The city did not care. The world did not pause. Life continued, constant and forward-moving, and all you could do was move with it. She fell asleep that night more easily than she had expected. The solicitor appointment was made. Saturday was coming. Owen was real and steady, and hers. The dress was gone, but she was not gone. She slept and did not dream, and in the morning she rose before the light again and went to the flowers. Saturday came with a gray sky and the smell of rain that had not yet decided to arrive. Nadia appeared at the shop at 10 in the morning in a bright orange coat that she wore with the kind of confidence that made other people feel more confident just by proximity. She had brought pastries and 2 takeaway coffees and she handed one to Alara without ceremony. "Right," she said, settling onto the workroom stool with the decisiveness of someone who had already made a plan. "Tell me your measurements, your budget, and what you absolutely will not wear," Alara told her. Nadia made notes on her phone. Then she said, "I found 3 shops we haven't tried yet. One near the Ring, one in the 6th district, and one in Margaretten that someone at the hospital told me about. We're going to all 3. They went to all 3. The first shop had beautiful dresses but nothing that felt right. The second had one possibility, a clean ivory gown with a flowing hem, that Alara tried on and felt almost but not quite herself in. Almost was not enough, not for this. The third shop was small and slightly hard to find, tucked between a bookshop and a hardware store on a quiet street in the 5th district. A handwritten sign in the window said open and there were flowers in the door glass, real ones. A few dried lavender stems tied with a ribbon. Alara and Nadia went inside. The woman who ran the shop was named Clara, like Alara's assistant but different in every other way. A tall woman with a measuring tape permanently slung around her neck and an eye for what people actually wanted, rather than what they thought they wanted. She looked at Alara for a moment and said, "Not the fussy ones. You want something that looks like it was made for you." "Yes," Alara said. Clara disappeared into the back and returned with 4 dresses on a rolling rack. She held each one up briefly, watching Alara's face, and on the 3rd one, she saw whatever she was looking for and stopped. It was not identical to the lost dress. It was not trying to be. It was ivory silk, yes, but the lace was at the hem rather than the collar, and the silhouette was slightly different, a little fuller at the skirt, a little more presence to it. Clara held it out, and Alara took it. In the fitting room, she put it on and turned to face the small mirror. Nadia was on the other side of the curtain, waiting. Alara stood there for a moment and took stock of what she felt. Not the same as the first time, but something close, something true. She drew the curtain back. Nadia looked up from her phone. Her expression said everything. "That's it," Nadia said. Alara looked at herself again in the larger mirror outside the fitting room. Clara stood to one side, arms folded, expression professionally neutral, waiting. "I'll take it," Alara said. Clara unfolded her arms and said, "Good. I'll need to take in the shoulders by about 1/2 centimeter. Come back Thursday and it'll be ready." They left the shop and walked back toward the main street, and Nadia said, "Are you happy?" Not in the easy way people ask that question, but in the real way, the careful way, the way that wants a true answer. Alara thought about it. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." "Good," Nadia said. "Because you deserve to be." They found a small cafe on the corner and ordered soup and bread and sat across from each other at a table by the window while the gray sky finally made up its mind and started to rain, lightly, against the glass. Nadia told her about a difficult week at the hospital. Alara told her about a wedding arrangement she had built that week that had turned out better than she expected. They talked about Owen and about Nadia's ongoing situation with a man from her building who she described as extremely complicated, which Alara understood to mean she liked him more than she wanted to. They talked about Alara's solicitor appointment, now 3 days away. "Tell me honestly," Nadia said, tearing a piece of bread. "Are you nervous about the appointment?" "Yes," Alara said, "but less nervous than I expected to be. I think I was more nervous before she sold the dress." "Because you still hoped things might change?" "Because I still had some patience left." She looked out at the rain. "I don't anymore." Nadia nodded. She did not say anything triumphant or told you so about it. She just nodded, the way a good friend nods when they have been right about something for years, and care more about the person than about being right. The soup came. The rain continued. They ate and talked, and the afternoon moved gently around them. On the way home, Alara passed the end of Brower Street and glanced toward Frau Heller's shop without meaning to. The window display had changed since Tuesday. New items, a different arrangement of second-hand things given a second life. She thought about the woman who had bought her dress. She wondered what she was like. She wondered if she knew, standing in that fitting room on Tuesday afternoon, that she was trying on something that someone had saved for and hidden and cared about. Probably not. Why would she? A dress is a dress until you know its story. She walked on. The solicitor's office was in the 4th district, on a quiet street of professional buildings with polished door plaques. Dr. Kunze herself was a woman in her 50s, precise in manner, with a habit of asking one question at a time, and waiting for the full answer before asking the next. Alara liked her immediately. She explained the situation from the beginning, the will, her father's instructions, the 2-year residence clause that had now long expired, the ongoing presence of Margaretha and her daughters, the dress, the money. Dr. Kunze listened to all of it without expression and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When Alara finished, she said, "The will is clear. You have been patient beyond any legal or moral requirement. We can file the appropriate notice this week." Alara said, "What will happen then?" Dr. Kunze said, "She will receive formal notification that the property is yours and that she has a set period to vacate. If she contests, we will respond. But based on what you've described, the will is unambiguous. This is not a complex case. It has simply not yet been acted upon." Alara nodded. On the way out, she stood on the pavement outside the office building and looked up at the gray and white sky. She thought about Weisgasse Street, about the house her father had built a life in, the house where she had grown up with his folded newspapers and his evening questions about the best part of the day, and his steady, unshowy love. The house was hers. It had always been hers. She had simply been waiting for the courage to say so clearly and in writing. She walked to the tram stop and stood with her hands in her coat pockets and waited for the number 4, which came 3 minutes later, yellow and ordinary, and took her away from that street and toward the next thing. The week before the wedding was the most beautiful and most overwhelming week of Ilara's recent life. There were flowers to arrange, because of course she arranged her own, and there were last fittings and a small dinner with Frances Hartley at which Owen's mother gave Ilara a pearl earring set that had belonged to Owen's grandmother and said, without ceremony or sentimentality, that she was glad Owen had found someone with sense. There were phone calls and lists and the kind of low-grade pleasant chaos that surrounds any approaching celebration. And underneath all of it, there was the anticipation, quiet and warm, of the life that was beginning. The notice had been filed with Margaretha. Ilara had not delivered it herself. Dr. Kunz's office had sent it by registered post, formal and correct. Margaretha had not said anything to Ilara directly, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Something had tightened. The napkin folding happened earlier in the evenings now. The remarks at the dinner table had stopped. Petra and Louisa seemed, for the first time, slightly uncertain of their footing in the hallways. Ilara did not feel triumphant about this. She did not feel angry. She felt, mostly, tired of the whole history of it. She was ready for it to be over. On the Thursday before the wedding, she went back to the small shop in the 5th district to collect the altered dress. Clara had the shoulders taken in exactly right. Ilara tried it on once more and it was perfect, more perfect than before, fitted now to her exact shape in a way that the first dress had also been, in a way that made her feel, again, like herself standing in her own body on the edge of something real. She carried it home in its white garment bag, this time placed not behind her coats but on the hook behind her bedroom door, in plain sight, in the room that was hers. No one would touch it. Not this time. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped through the mail slot at Blumenwerk along with 2 invoices and a catalog from a wholesale supplier. Ilara almost set it aside without opening it. The envelope was cream-colored and heavier than ordinary post, with her full name typed on the front in an old-fashioned serif font and a crest embossed at the top left corner that she did not recognize at first glance. She set down the other mail and looked at the crest more carefully. It was oval in shape, containing a stylized hawk above a set of 2 interlocking keys. Below it, in small capital letters, were the words, Voss Hartmann. She stood at the workroom counter and looked at this for a long moment. Then she opened the envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages, typed on thick cream paper. It was from the legal office of Duke Maximilian Voss Hartmann, and it stated, in clear and careful language, that the Voss Hartmann family had commissioned a genealogical study of the Voss lineage across Austria some months ago, as part of an ongoing effort to document the family's full historical record. The study, conducted by a certified archivist, had produced a finding of significance. Ilara Voss, daughter of the late Gerhard Friedrich Voss of Vienna, was a legitimate descendant of a branch of the Voss family that had separated from the main line in the late 19th century. The connection was distant, but it was legally and genealogically documented. The Duke wished to extend a formal acknowledgement of this connection and requested a meeting at the family estate at her earliest convenience. A contact number was provided. Ilara read the letter twice. Then she put it down on the counter and stood very still in the middle of her workroom. The flowers around her were fragrant and ordinary. A bucket of white roses was dripping quietly onto the floor. Through the front window she could see the street outside, the usual morning people moving at the usual morning pace. She picked up her phone and called Nadia. Nadia answered on the 4th ring with a slightly muffled voice that meant she was eating breakfast. Ilara said, "I think I might be related to a duke." There was a long pause. Then Nadia swallowed audibly and said, "Say that again." Ilara said it again. Nadia made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated everything. Then she said, "Read me the letter." Ilara read her the letter. When she finished, there was another pause, longer this time. "Voss Hartmann," Nadia said, "as in the estate outside Vienna, near Grinzing?" "I don't know which estate." "There's a Voss Hartmann estate near Grinzing. I've seen the gates, iron gates with the hawk on them." Ilara looked at the crest on the envelope, a stylized hawk. "Oh," she said. "Ilara," Nadia said, "your last name is Voss. I know what my last name is. And your father's middle name was Friedrich." "Friedrich, yes. And you always said your father's family were very old Viennese, that he didn't know much about them beyond a few generations back." Ilara thought of her father. She thought of the way he had sometimes spoken about the family name, with a kind of vague pride he couldn't quite explain. He had said once, when Ilara was young, that the name Voss was older than most people knew, and that the family had once been something more than accountants and shopkeepers, though he had said it with humor rather than any seriousness. She had taken it as the kind of thing fathers said, the kind of gentle mythology families build around themselves. But here was this letter, on real paper, with a real crest, from a real legal office. She said to Nadia, I'm going to call the number. Nadia said, Yes, you are. Right now. And then you call me back. She hung up. Alara stood in her workroom with the letter in one hand and her phone in the other. Clara arrived at the door with her coat half on, slightly out of breath as usual. She looked at Alara's expression and stopped. Is everything all right? Yes, Alara said. Hold the front for a while, please. I need to make a call. She went into the back office, which was barely large enough for a desk and a chair, and closed the door, and dialed the number at the bottom of the second page. It rang 3 times. Then a woman's voice answered, professional and pleasant. Voss Hartman Estate Office. Good morning, Alara said. Good morning. My name is Alara Voss. I received a letter from your office this morning regarding a genealogical finding. Ah, yes. One moment, please. The line clicked and held. There was silence. Alara looked at the small window in the back office, which faced a brick wall, and she waited. A man's voice came on the line. Calm, measured, with a slight quality of directness. Good morning, Fräulein Voss. This is Maximilian Voss Hartmann. Thank you for calling so quickly. She had not known what to expect. She had half expected a secretary again, or a solicitor, not the Duke himself. He spoke without formality for a title, directly and without ceremony. He said, I imagine the letter was something of a surprise. She said, It was. I understand. These findings often are. He paused. The archivist's report is thorough. We would very much like to meet with you, if you're willing, not to impose anything or to make claims on your life, but simply to share what's been found, and to extend a formal acknowledgement. The family takes the question of lineage seriously. She thought about what she wanted to say. Then she said, Can you tell me what the connection is exactly? How far back? He told her. The branch had separated in 1887 when a younger son of the main family had left to pursue a career independent of the estate and had taken a different path through Vienna. His descendants had moved through middle-class life over the generations, and the paper trail had grown thin, but the archivist had followed it carefully, and the documentation was complete. Your great-great-grandfather was a Voss Hartmann, the Duke said. He took the simplified name when he left. It was not unusual at the time. She absorbed this slowly. A great-great-grandfather. A name slightly shortened across a century. A thread running back through time that nobody in her father's family had known was there, or perhaps had known and not spoken about, or perhaps had simply forgotten the way things get forgotten when life is busy and immediate and full of other concerns. I would like to meet, she said. It surprised her slightly, how clearly she said it. Excellent, he said. When would suit you? They agreed on a date, the following Friday afternoon. He gave her the address, though it turned out she did not need it. It was the estate near Grinzing, the one with the iron gates and the hawk. After she hung up, she sat very still in the small office for a full minute. Then she picked up her phone and called Nadia back. Nadia picked up immediately. Well? Alara said. I spoke to him directly. The Duke himself answered the phone. And? He's very normal, Alara said. On the phone, I mean. Calm. Polite. He told me about the great-great-grandfather. She explained it. Nadia listened without interrupting, which was itself remarkable. When Alara finished, Nadia said, So your family name has been Voss this whole time, and his is Voss Hartmann, and you come from the same root. That's what the archivist found. Nadia was quiet for a moment, then she said with a peculiar thoughtfulness, Alara, your stepmother sold your dress, and 3 days later a duke called you to tell you that your family name is one of the oldest in Vienna. Alara said nothing. Nadia said, That's not something that happens to most people. No, Alara said. I suppose it isn't. She went back to the workroom. She finished the day's arrangements. She filled 3 orders and sent Clara on the afternoon deliveries. She tidied the workroom and watered the remaining stock and locked the shop at 6:15, and she walked home through the early evening in a state that was not quite calmness and not quite excitement, but something in between. Something like the feeling you get when a door opens in a wall you had assumed was solid. At home she said nothing about the letter. She cooked her dinner. She washed up. She went upstairs. She sat at her desk and took out her notebook and wrote the Duke's name at the top of a clean page and then put the pen down and looked at it. Voss Hartmann. Her name was Voss. A shortened version of the same name, carried through 4 generations by people who probably did not know the full story of how it had been shortened, or if they did, had set the knowledge down somewhere and forgotten where they left it. Her father had said the name was older than most people knew. He had been right. He simply had not known how right he was. She thought about him then, more vividly than she had in months. She thought about his folded newspaper corners and his questions about the best part of the day, and the way he would sometimes just stand in the doorway of whatever room she was in, not saying anything, just checking that she was there, just knowing where she was. She had taken it completely for granted as a child. She understood now that it had been a form of love, quiet and undemanding, and steadily offered, the kind that does not need words to prove itself. She wished she could tell him about the letter. She closed the notebook. She picked up her phone and texted Owen. "Got some news. Nothing bad. Tell you tomorrow?" He replied within a minute. "Of course. You all right?" She replied, "Yes. Actually, genuinely yes." He sent back a small drawing of a duck. It was their private language for something that had no translation, a little meaningless warm signal between people who knew each other well enough to not need words for everything. She smiled. She put down the phone. She looked at the new dress on the hook behind her door, ivory and right, and she felt the strangeness of the week settle into something she could hold. Not all of life arrives in order. Not all of the good comes before the hard. Sometimes the timing is inverted and the grace arrives late and from an unexpected direction. But it arrives. She lay down. The room was quiet. The house creaked once and went still. Somewhere outside, the city moved on in the dark. The estate sat behind iron gates at the end of a private road, just outside Grinzing, surrounded by mature trees that were turning gold in the late September light. The gates were exactly as Nadia had described them, wrought iron, high, with the hawk crest worked into the metal at the top center. Ilara sat in her small car for a moment, after pulling up to the intercom panel, and looked at the gates and took a breath. She had dressed simply. A navy coat over a gray wool dress, her good shoes, her hair pinned neatly. She had wanted to look presentable without looking as though she had spent excessive time trying to look presentable. She had spent, in truth, about 45 minutes on it, which she considered reasonable given the circumstances. She pressed the intercom. A voice asked her name. She gave it. The gates opened. The drive up to the house took about 2 minutes along a gravel path lined with oak trees on both sides. The house itself came into view gradually, not all at once, which gave her time to take it in without being overwhelmed. It was large, old, built in a pale stone that had gone the color of cream with age, wide windows, a formal garden to one side with late-season roses, a set of stone steps leading up to the main entrance where a young woman in professional dress was already waiting. She was shown into a sitting room that was not the grand formal kind she had been half expecting, but something more comfortable. Good furniture, certainly, but lived in. Books on the shelves, a plant in the corner that looked like it had been there for years, a fire in the grate, though the day was not very cold. She sat down and accepted the offer of tea and told herself to breathe. He came in about 5 minutes later. Duke Maximilian Voss Hartmann was 34 years old and had the bearing of someone who had grown up being looked at in formal settings and had long since stopped noticing it. He was tall, with dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, and he moved into the room with the kind of ease that comes from being at home in it, which of course he was. He extended his hand and shook hers with the straightforward pressure of someone who has never needed to perform confidence. "Fräulein Voss," he said, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for the letter," she said. It was unexpected. A corner of his mouth moved. "I imagine. Please, sit." He sat across from her. The tea arrived. He poured his own without ceremony. This surprised her a little, and then she realized that she had built up some idea of what a duke would be like in a sitting room, and that it had not accounted for someone who just poured their own tea. He said, "I'd like to show you the archival documents before we talk about anything else. I think it's easier to have a conversation about this once you've seen the evidence yourself. It's more satisfying than just taking my word for it." She agreed that it was. A man was brought in who was introduced as Ernst, the family archivist, a quiet person in his 50s with round glasses and a leather satchel from which he produced a bound folder of documents. He laid them out on the low table between the chairs and walked her through them with the methodical thoroughness of someone who loves his work. Birth records, church registers, a marriage record from 1887, a letter, handwritten, in Old German that Ernst translated paragraph by paragraph, from a man named Wilhelm Voss Hartmann to his brother, explaining that he was leaving to make his own way. Ilara leaned over the documents. Her great-great-grandfather, a man named Wilhelm who had left and shortened his name and made a different life, who had children, who had children, who had a son who worked as an accountant and raised Ilara alone, and asked her every evening what the best part of her day had been. She sat back. "It's real," she said. It was not a question. Ernst nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose work has produced an undeniable result. Maximilian looked at her. "It's real," he said. "You are not the primary heir to anything. The estate is entailed along the direct line, but you are a documented and legitimate member of the Voss lineage, and that means something to us. We take the family record seriously." She asked him to explain what that meant in practical terms. He was direct about it. There was no inheritance, no property claim, no financial implication. What it meant was recognition, the right to be formally listed in the family record, an invitation to family gatherings should she choose to attend. And, he mentioned almost in passing, he had been hoping to extend an invitation to an upcoming event. He reached to the side table and picked up an envelope and handed it to her. She opened it. The card inside was heavy and gilt-edged. It was an invitation to the Habsburg Charity Gala, held annually at the Hofburg Palace, in 3 weeks' time. Her name was printed on the card in full, Ilara Voss. Beside her name, in smaller print, Guest of Honor, Voss lineage. She looked up. He said, "These events are important for the family's public presence. Having the full lineage represented is something we value. You would be under no obligation, but I hope you'll consider it." She looked at the card again. The Hofburg Palace. 3 weeks from now. 1 week after her wedding. She said, "I'll be on my honeymoon." He blinked, very slightly. "I'm sorry? My wedding is in 2 weeks." She said, "I'll be away the week of the gala." He looked at her for a moment and then said, "Congratulations." She thanked him. "Would it be possible to attend the following year? The event is annual." "Yes," she said. "I think it would." He nodded. Then he looked at her with the kind of directness that she had noticed on the phone, and that she was beginning to understand was simply his manner, not calculated, just honest. "You don't seem overwhelmed," he said. "I'm processing," she said. "I'm good at processing while appearing calm. That's a useful quality." "I've had practice," she said, and there was something in her tone that she hadn't quite planned, a note of dry acknowledgement that acknowledged without explaining, and he caught it. He said, after a brief pause, "Is there something else happening, aside from all of this?" She considered the question. She had not planned to say anything. It was not his business. But he had asked with a plainness that made a plain answer feel natural, and she said, "It has been a complicated few weeks." He waited. She said, "Someone sold my wedding dress." He looked at her. She said, "Not an accident. Deliberately. To make a point." He said, "Who?" She said, "Someone who was given too much room in my life for too long." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you find another dress?" She said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Good." It was such a simple response, no dramatics, no outrage on her behalf, no hollow reassurances, just a clean acknowledgement that the problem had been met with a solution, and that this was the right outcome, and she appreciated it more than she would have appreciated something more elaborate. The archivist packed his documents away. The tea was finished. The fire had settled into quieter coals. She asked about the family. He told her a few things, not a formal recital but a genuine answer to a genuine question, the kind of conversation you have with someone you have just met but who is, in some strange documentary way, a distant relative. He asked about her work. She told him she was a florist. He said, "What's your favorite flower to arrange?" She was startled, not because it was an unusual question, but because of the timing, because of how simple it was, because nobody in her house on Weisgasse Street had ever once asked her a question like that. A question that assumed her work was interesting, a question that treated her as someone whose preferences were worth knowing. She said, "Freesia, because it smells the way spring is supposed to smell, and because it's underestimated." He considered this. "Underestimated," he repeated, as if filing it somewhere. She stood, and he stood. They shook hands again at the door. He said, "I hope the wedding is everything you want it to be." She said, "I think it will be." She walked back down the stone steps and along the gravel drive to her car and drove back through the gates, which closed behind her in the rearview mirror with a solid, unhurried movement. She got 2 streets away before she pulled over and sat for a moment and let the afternoon settle into something comprehensible. She called Nadia. Nadia answered immediately. "Well?" Ilara said, "The documents are real. The archivist was very thorough. My great-great-grandfather left the family in 1887 and shortened the name." Nadia made a sound that was part disbelief and part delight. "And the Duke?" "Younger than I expected, very direct, poured his own tea." "He poured his own tea? He just picked up the pot." "I love him," Nadia said. "You've never met him. I love the idea of him. Did he give you anything?" Ilara told her about the invitation and the timing and the honeymoon. Nadia laughed at this, long and genuine. "Only you," she said. Only you would have a duke try to invite you to a gala and have to turn him down because you're going on your honeymoon. Ilara smiled at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked, she thought, like herself. Tired but genuine, complicated but intact. She said, "He asked what my favorite flower to arrange is." Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did you say?" "Freesia." "Good answer." A pause. "He's interested in you, you know. He's interested in the lineage." "Ilara, I'm getting married in 2 weeks, Nadia." "I know. I was your first phone call when Owen proposed, and I bought you soup in the rain when the dress was stolen, and I am going to be the one standing closest to you when you walk down the aisle. I know you're getting married. I'm simply noting that the Duke asked about your favorite flower." Ilara said nothing. Nadia said, "Drive home, Ilara. You have a wedding to finish planning." She drove home. The house on Weissgasse Street was quieter than usual when she arrived. Margarete was somewhere upstairs. Petra and Luisa were not in the common rooms. The kitchen was empty and clean, which was unusual at this hour. Ilara set her keys on the hook by the door. She took off her coat. She went upstairs. In her room, the dress was still on the hook behind the door. Ivory silk, the hem lace catching the last of the afternoon light through the window. She stood and looked at it for a while, and she thought about the week, the loss of the first dress, the receipt with the real number, Frau Heller's kind face, the consignment shop window, Owen's voice on the phone, the little shop in the 5th district, the cream envelope, the iron gates, the archivist's careful documents, the hawk on the crest, the Duke pouring his own tea, the question about the flower. "Freesia," she had said, "because it's underestimated." She changed out of her good clothes and put on something comfortable and went downstairs and made tea and sat at the kitchen table alone in the quiet and looked out the window at the garden, which was going to sleep now in the way gardens do in autumn, drawing down, going inward, preparing for the long pause before the next beginning. She drank her tea. She thought about her father. She thought about the name Voss, old and layered and hers in a way she had not fully understood until today. Then she called Owen and told him everything, from the letter to the archivist to the question about the flower, and he listened to all of it, and at the end he said, with the warm steadiness that she loved more than almost anything, "Your great-great-grandfather left and shortened his name, and made a different life. And now his great-great-granddaughter is getting married in 2 weeks, and a duke poured his own tea for her." She laughed. "Yes," she said, "that's about right." "I think that's a good story," Owen said. "I think so too," she said. She hung up and sat in the kitchen a while longer. The garden was dark now. The house was quiet. 3 days until the solicitor's notice would take its next step. 2 weeks until the wedding. 1 year, 1 week, or 1 lifetime, until she would walk back through those iron gates for the annual gala. But those were all future things. Tonight there was only the kitchen and the tea and the quiet and the name she had carried her whole life without knowing its full weight. Voss. It was older than most people knew. The morning the formal notice was delivered to Weissgasse Street, Ilara was not at home. She had deliberately arranged to be at the shop, which she later thought was less about avoiding the confrontation and more about not wanting to be present for Margarete's first reaction. There was a difference, she was clear about that in her own mind, between removing herself from a fight and simply not attending the moment at which a legal document arrived in a registered envelope, addressed to a woman who had been living in someone else's house for far too long. Dr. Kunz's assistant called to confirm delivery at 10:47 in the morning. Ilara was in the middle of binding a hand-tied bouquet of late-season dahlias, deep orange and rust-colored, for a customer who was visiting a friend in hospital. She thanked the assistant and went back to the flowers. Clara was watching her from across the workroom. "Good news?" Clara said. "Progress," Ilara said. She finished the bouquet. She tied the ribbon. She set it down and looked at it and decided it was right. The thing about making something with your hands is that it anchors you. When the mind wants to run off in all directions, the hands keep you in the present. There is a stem that needs cutting. There is a proportion that needs adjusting. There is a specific quality of water that keeps the flowers fresh, and you have to check the buckets every morning and top them up because the flowers drink overnight, and by morning the levels have dropped. These are ordinary tasks, but they are real ones, and real tasks, done attentively, are a form of steadiness that no amount of thinking can replicate. She worked through the morning. At lunch she sat in the back office and ate the cheese roll she had brought from home, and read through the file Dr. Kunze had sent her earlier in the week, the summary of the legal position, the timeline for the next steps. Margarete had 40 days from the date of notice to vacate the property. The notice was clear and legal and final. There would likely be a response from Margarete's side, Dr. Kunze had said, but the position was unambiguous. The will was unambiguous. 3 years of the house not being claimed did not create any legal right for the occupant. It simply meant that it had not yet been acted upon. It was being acted upon now. Alara put the file away and looked out the small window at the brick wall. She thought about the house. She thought about what it had been when her father was alive. The smell of his morning coffee. The way he hummed while he read the newspaper, slightly off-key, without noticing he was doing it. The loose board on the third step that he had always meant to fix and never did. The lemon tree in the garden that her mother had planted before she left and that he had tended with more loyalty than most people would have shown, watering it every week through the growing season, not because it gave good lemons, it did not give particularly good lemons, but because it was still something that had been planted in the garden of his life, and he believed in tending things. She thought about what she would do with the house when it was truly hers again. She had been thinking about this on and off for weeks, and the idea had grown clearer with each revisiting. She wanted to make it a working space as well as a living space. She wanted to use the ground floor, which had a good-sized room that opened onto the garden, as a studio, flowers and events, small celebrations, the kind of intimate work she did best. It would take time, and it would take money, neither of which she had in abundance, but she had learned something in the past weeks about the relationship between time and intention. You do not need everything in place to begin, you need only the next step. The next step, right now, was the wedding. Owen had come over 2 evenings ago to help her with some of the practical wedding logistics, the seating arrangements, the music list, the order of the small ceremony. They had spread papers across the kitchen table while Margareta and her daughters were out, and they had worked through everything with cups of tea and occasional disagreements about which song should play during the signing of the register. And it had been one of the nicest evenings Alara could remember in recent months. Just the two of them, doing the ordinary beautiful work of planning a life. She had looked at him across the table at one point, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, frowning at the seating chart, and she had thought, this is the person I chose. This deliberate, kind, slightly chaotic man with his grandmother's ring and his stolen sandwiches. She had thought, I am so glad I chose him. He had looked up and caught her looking and said, what? She had said, nothing. You have tea on your chin. He had wiped his chin. There was no tea there. She was very pleased with herself. The afternoon at the shop moved quietly. She completed 4 more arrangements and gave 2 telephone consultations for upcoming events, and ordered fresh stock for the following week. Clara handled the counter while Alara stayed mostly in the workroom. This was the division of labor they had settled into naturally, without much discussion. Clara was warm and good with customers and made people feel at ease when they came in uncertain about what they wanted. Alara worked better with the flowers than with the ambiguity of wanting, which was perhaps why she was better at making things than explaining them. At 4:30, Nadia appeared at the front of the shop still in her nurse's scrubs, having come directly from her shift. She had a container of leftover soup from the hospital canteen that she seemed to have brought as a peace offering for arriving unannounced. Don't look at me like that, she said, coming into the workroom and handing Alara the soup. I have 2 hours between shifts and I wanted to see you and I didn't want to call ahead, because you always say you're fine on the phone. Alara accepted the soup and got 2 spoons from the kitchen drawer. They sat on the workroom stools and split the soup and talked. Nadia told her about a particularly trying patient and a particularly rewarding one, and the difference between the two. Alara told her about the notice delivery confirmation and Dr. Kunz's timeline. Nadia listened and nodded. Then Nadia said, have you heard from the estate again? From Maximilian? Alara said, he sent a short note to confirm the invitation for next year's gala. Very formal. Very formal, Nadia repeated. He is a duke, Nadia. And he asked about your favorite flower. We have had this conversation. I just like saying it. Alara pointed the spoon at her. You have a man in your building you are refusing to acknowledge. Nadia immediately straightened up. That is completely different and not relevant. It is extremely relevant. I don't want to discuss it. Neither do I, apparently, and yet here we are. They looked at each other. Then Nadia smiled, and Alara smiled. And Clara poked her head into the workroom to see if they needed anything, and found them laughing over a container of hospital soup, and retreated without asking any further questions. Nadia had to leave at 6. She stood up and put on her coat and looked at Alara with the steady, direct gaze she had, the one that meant she was saying something she wanted to say properly. You know what I think about all of this, she said. The last month. The dress, the solicitor, the estate, all of it. Alara said, tell me. Nadia said, I think Margareta sold the dress because she thought it would hurt you in a place where you couldn't recover. She thought it would knock you down right before the best day of your year. And instead it just cleared a path. Alara was quiet for a moment. Cleared a path to what? Nadia pulled on her coat. To what you already were. You just couldn't see the whole shape of it until something knocked the loose pieces away. She left. Elara locked the shop and walked home in the early evening dark. The house was quiet. Margareta was in the sitting room. Elara saw the light under the door as she passed through the hall. She did not stop. She went upstairs. She sat at her desk and opened a notebook. She wrote, 10 days. She looked at the words for a while. Then she wrote below them, the dress is on the hook. Owen is real. The name is old. She closed the notebook. She picked up her phone and looked at the message from Dr. Kunz's office sent that morning. The one confirming delivery of the notice. She thought about the 40-day clock that was now ticking. She thought about what would happen at the end of it. She thought about the lemon tree in the garden. She would keep the lemon tree. Whatever else changed about the house, she would keep the lemon tree. She put her phone down and went to stand at the window. The street below was quiet at this hour, just a few lit windows across the way, and the yellow puddles of the street lamps on the wet pavement. She put her palm against the glass, which was cold. In 10 days she would marry Owen. In some number of days after that, this house would be entirely, undeniably, legally hers to live in and decide about and tend. And in some number of months or years after that, she would walk back through iron gates with a hawk on them to a formal gala in the Hofburg Palace and be announced as a member of a lineage that had been running quietly and continuously through time, since long before anyone in her family had thought to notice it. None of that was something she had planned. None of it was something she could have arranged. It had arrived the way the best things sometimes arrive, not when you are ready for them, but when you have stopped waiting and started simply working with what is actually in front of you. She took her palm from the window. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought of nothing specific, just let the thoughts move through without catching any of them, and eventually the dark went soft and the city sounds faded into white noise and she slept. She did not know, lying there, what was still coming. She did not know that in 8 days, standing in the middle of a room full of candlelight and formal gowns, she would recognize something impossible across a crowded floor. She did not know the conversation that would follow, or the choice that the other person would make, or how it would feel to hold something recovered in her hands. She only knew it was 10 days to the wedding. She slept. The gala was held on the second Saturday in October, and Elara was not supposed to be there. She and Owen had returned from their honeymoon 4 days earlier. They had gone to a small coastal village in Slovenia, a place Owen had been once before and had described with a quiet enthusiasm that made Elara trust it. He had been right. It was beautiful in the particular way of places that are not trying to be anything. A harbor with old fishing boats, a hillside with olive trees, dinners at a table outdoors until the last light went and then past it, because neither of them could stop talking. They had come home to Vienna, sun-warmed and quiet and settled, and had spent the first 2 days back doing very ordinary things, unpacking and washing clothes and making grocery lists and walking the neighborhood. Elara had opened the shop on Wednesday. Owen had returned to school on Thursday. Life had resumed at its normal pace, but with a different quality to the ordinariness, a warmth in it that had not been there before, a sense of the ordinary things belonging to a shared life rather than a solitary one. They were not living at Weissgasse Street yet. Margareta had not vacated. The 40-day notice was still running. Elara and Owen were temporarily staying at Owen's flat in the 3rd district, which was smaller than ideal, but bright and full of his books and the particular pleasant disorder of a person who reads widely and files loosely. She did not mind it. The invitation to the gala had been extended to the following year. That had been the plan. Then, on Thursday morning, a second note arrived at the shop from the estate office. It was short. Duke Maximilian had found himself with a spare ticket for this year's event. The note said that he understood it was short notice and that she was recently returned from her honeymoon and had no obligation whatsoever, but that the invitation stood if she and her husband wished to attend. No pressure. The family would be glad to see her. She read the note twice at the workroom counter. She called Owen at his school during his lunch break. She said, "There's a spare ticket to the Hofburg Gala, this Saturday." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Is this the Hawkgate Duke?" "Yes." "And this is this Saturday, 4 days from now?" "Yes." He was quiet again, then, "Elara, I have been waiting for months to see the inside of that building. Tell me we can go." She laughed. "We can go." She called the estate office and confirmed their attendance. She called Nadia and told her. Nadia made the sound she always made when things were going in a direction she had anticipated and approved of. Elara told her not to start. Nadia said she had said nothing. She found something to wear. She did not have a formal evening gown in her wardrobe, which was a practical problem she had not previously needed to solve. She called Frances, Owen's mother, who had opinions about everything and excellent taste, and who arrived at the flat on Friday afternoon with 2 garment bags over her arm and an expression of focused purpose. The second dress was a deep midnight blue that Frances had bought for an event several years ago and never worn again, and it fit Alara almost perfectly. It needed only a small adjustment at the waist, which Frances pinned in 3 minutes flat and said she would sew by morning. "You'll look wonderful," Frances said, standing back and looking at Alara with satisfaction. "Thank you for not making a big thing of it," Alara said. Frances looked at her. "This is a big thing, Alara. You are going to the Hofburg Palace as a guest of honor of an old family. Your family name, on a Saturday." She picked up the garment bags. "But there's no need to make a fuss about it," she added, with a practicality that Alara recognized as one of the things Owen had inherited from her. "Just go and enjoy yourself." She did exactly that. The Hofburg Palace in Vienna at night is not a place that allows you to be unmoved by it. The exterior is stone and scale and the weight of centuries, and the interior is high ceilings and candlelight and the kind of accumulated history that makes even the most composed person slow their steps slightly upon entering. Alara and Owen arrived together, Owen in his one good dark suit with a tie Alara had chosen, and she in the midnight blue dress with Frances's pearl earrings, and they walked through the entrance together, and Alara stopped just inside the door and looked up at the ceiling. Owen waited beside her. She said, "All right, a moment." He said, "Take as long as you need." She looked at the ceiling for a moment longer, and then she took a breath and they went in. Maximilian found them early in the evening, making his way through the assembled guests with the ease of someone who has done this many times and can move through a crowded formal room without making it seem like an effort. He greeted Alara with genuine warmth and shook Owen's hand with equal sincerity and spent 10 minutes with them both, asking Owen about teaching in a way that was actually curious rather than politely formal. Owen, who was good with people and not easily impressed by settings, responded with a naturalness that Alara was glad for. After Maximilian moved on to other guests, Owen said to her quietly, "I understand about the tea now." She said, "What?" "He just pours his own tea, you can tell." She smiled. The evening was beautiful. The candles and the music and the careful formality of it. The way people moved through the room with the awareness that they were in a place that meant something. She spoke to several people she had never met, family members of the Voss-Hartmann line, distant ones, cousins of cousins, people who were connected to her by a thread that ran back further than any of them could fully trace but that was nonetheless real. One of them, an elderly woman named Greta who walked with a cane and had the air of someone who had seen approximately everything, took Alara's hand when they were introduced and said, "I heard about your father, Gerhard Voss. He was your grandfather's second cousin once removed. I met him once when you were very small. He brought you to a garden party. You ate all the strawberries." Alara stared at her. The woman smiled. "You were about 3. You had a red dress on." Alara's father had taken her to a garden party when she was 3. She did not remember it. But the red dress she had been told about. Her father had a photograph somewhere, in the album she had been given when he died, of her at approximately that age in a red dress with strawberry stains down the front. She said, "He never talked about the broader family." Greta said, "He probably did not know much of it. That branch went quiet very early, but he knew enough to be proud of the name." She had said the same thing herself once, that the name was older than most people knew. "Yes," Alara said, "he did." She stayed with Greta for a while, listening. The old woman had stories that were not dramatic but were layered and specific in the way that true stories are, full of small details that could not be invented. Alara listened and stored them, and thought that she would write some of them down when she got home. Owen found her later in the evening, near the window that overlooked one of the palace's inner courtyards. He brought her a glass of water and stood beside her, and they looked out at the lit courtyard below together. He said, "Are you having a good evening?" She said, "Yes, actually yes. Are you?" He said, "I talked to a man for 40 minutes about the history of Habsburg tax policy." "Was it interesting?" "Incredibly," he said, with complete sincerity. She loved him for this. She was about to say something else when she saw the woman. She was standing near the far side of the room, talking to someone Alara did not recognize. She was wearing an ivory dress, silk, with lace at the hem, a silhouette that Alara had last seen in a small fitting room in a bridal boutique on a wet Tuesday in October, a year ago. Alara stood very still. Owen noticed immediately. "What is it?" She said, "That woman across the room." He looked, she said quietly. "She's wearing my dress." He looked at her. "Your wedding dress, the one that was sold?" "Yes." There was a pause. Then Owen said very calmly, "What do you want to do?" She watched the woman for a moment. She was well-dressed, well-presented, moving through the room with ease. She seemed pleasant. She had no idea she was being looked at by the person who had saved the dress she was wearing for 11 months and hidden it behind a winter coat to keep it safe. Elara said, "I want to talk to her." Owen said, "Then talk to her." She crossed the room. She approached the woman during a pause in the conversation she was having. She introduced herself simply. She said her name and said that she wanted to ask about the dress, and she explained, briefly and without any drama, what the dress was, that it had been her wedding dress, that it had been sold without her knowledge from a consignment shop on Brower Street in September. The woman's expression changed completely as Elara spoke. She was perhaps 40, with a kind and open face, and she went from polite social attention to genuine shock and then something close to distress as the explanation unfolded. She said, "I had no idea. I found it on the rack and I loved it immediately, and I bought it without thinking twice. I had no idea." Elara said, "You couldn't have known. It wasn't your fault." The woman said, "But it was your wedding dress." "It was," Elara said. "I found another one. My wedding was 2 weeks ago." The woman looked at her for a moment, then she said, "Would you like it back?" Elara was quiet. The woman said, "I mean it. If it was yours, it should be yours. I can have it sent to you." Elara thought about the night she had first tried it on. The fitting room and the mirror and the feeling of being, for a moment, entirely herself. She thought about the ivory dress she had married Owen in, found in the small shop in the 5th District, which had also been right, which had been right in its own way and on its own terms. She said, "Yes, I would like it back." The woman looked relieved. She took out a card and gave it to Elara. She said her name was Helena. She said she was sorry for what had happened, the whole of it, not just the dress but the fact that someone had done this to Elara deliberately. She said it with a genuine feeling that Elara appreciated. They stood talking for a few minutes, and Elara understood, in the way you understand some people immediately, that Helena was the kind of person who would send the dress exactly when she said she would, and without any fuss. She thanked her and went back to Owen. He said, "Well?" She held up the card. He said, "She's sending it back?" She offered. I said yes. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had learned to read, the quiet, warm, slightly wondering look he had when something happened that aligned with his general belief that things do, eventually, tend to work out. She said, "Don't say it." He said, "I wasn't going to say anything. You were thinking it very loudly." He smiled. The evening moved toward its close. The candles burned lower. The music became quieter. People began to drift toward exits and conversations tapered into farewells. Maximilian found them again near the end and shook Owen's hand again and said to Elara, "I'm glad you came." She said, "So am I." He said, "Next year you'll come properly, with a proper invitation and more notice." She said, "Next year." He nodded. He moved on. She and Owen collected their coats and walked out into the night. The palace courtyard was lit, quiet now, the formal evening drawing down around them. She had Francis's pearl earrings in her ears and Owen's hand in hers and Helena's card in her pocket. She looked up at the stone facade of the building as they walked out, and thought about the evening, and the woman in her dress, and Greta, and the garden party she had no memory of, and the strawberries, and the red dress with the stains, and her father standing at some summer gate holding her small hand, being proud of a name he could not fully explain. Owen said, "Home?" She said, "Home." They walked out through the main gate and onto the street, where the ordinary city waited for them, trams and lampposts and the smell of late-night Vienna, cool and slightly damp, and completely itself. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. She thought about the dress. She thought about the fact that she had found it again, not by looking, not by planning, but simply by being in a room where it happened to be. The way things sometimes return, not because the world is fair or arranged for comfort, but because the world is large, and if you keep moving through it, you occasionally turn a corner and there is something you had thought was gone. They reached the tram stop. She leaned her head against his shoulder while they waited. The tram came. They got on. The city went past in bright and dark squares through the window. She thought, the dress is coming back. The house is coming back. The name was never lost. The wedding is done and it was right. Owen is beside me and he stole my sandwich and he will do it again and I don't mind at all. The tram bell rang. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the evening settle into her the way good evenings do, slowly, becoming a memory as it is still happening. The dress arrived on a Wednesday morning in a box that was careful and well packed. Helena had included a short handwritten note that said only, "I hope it belongs to you again properly. With warmth, Helena." The box was opened by Alara alone, standing in Owen's flat in the morning before she left for the shop. She lifted the tissue paper and there it was. Ivory silk, hand-stitched lace, at the collar and the sleeves. Slightly more lived in than it had been when she last touched it, but whole, undamaged, entirely itself. She held it for a moment. She thought about the 11 months she had saved for it. She thought about the fitting room and the mirror and the things she had felt standing in it. She thought about the closet in Weisgasse Street and the careful hiding and the Tuesday she came home and the space behind the coats and the kitchen and Margaretta's hands folding napkins. Then she carried it carefully to the spare room and hung it on the back of the door where the light could reach it, and she stood looking at it for a minute, and then she went to work. That was the 1st of November. By the 1st of December, Margaretta and her daughters had vacated the house on Weisgasse Street. The 40-day period had run its course. There had been a letter from a solicitor on Margaretta's behalf, raising a minor procedural point that Dr. Kunze had answered efficiently and completely within the same week. After that, there had been a request for an extension of 2 weeks, which Dr. Kunze had communicated to Alara. Alara had agreed to it without hesitation or resentment. 2 weeks was reasonable. She was not trying to win something. She was simply trying to have what was already hers. They left on a Sunday. Alara did not go to the house that day. She let Dr. Kunze's assistant handle the handover of keys. She went to the shop and made arrangements. 4 bouquets and a large centerpiece order for a company dinner that had come in at short notice, and she kept her hands busy and her thoughts even. She went to Weisgasse Street for the first time since the vacating on a Monday evening. She drove there after closing the shop and stood in front of it for a moment on the pavement, looking at the door. It was the same door it had always been. Dark green paint, slightly worn at the lower edge, with the brass number plate her father had polished every week and she had forgotten to polish since he died. She made a note to polish it. She went inside. It was empty in the way houses are when people have left them. Not echoing, not abandoned, just waiting. The rooms had that quality of a held breath. Her father's furniture was still in place, what remained of it. Some things Margaretta had taken, which was fine. What was left was enough. She walked through the rooms one by one. The sitting room, the kitchen with the window that looked onto the garden and the lemon tree, which was bare now in the winter but present, its branches holding the gray December light. The hallway with the hook for keys and the third step on the stairs that still needed fixing, and the smell that had always been the smell of this house, something wooden and slightly sweet and not identifiable beyond that, just the particular smell of a particular building that had held a particular life for a long time. She went upstairs, into her room. It was as she had left it, her things undisturbed. Her desk and her notebook and the mirror and the framed photograph of her father and, on the hook behind the door, the ivory dress she had collected from Owen's flat and brought home that morning. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. Hers, fully and finally and without reservation, hers. Owen was downstairs. He had come with her, though she had not asked him to, which was characteristic of him. He was in the kitchen making tea in the way of someone who was making himself useful without needing to be asked. She could hear him moving around, the sound of water running, the click of the kettle. She went back downstairs. He was standing at the counter with 2 mugs, looking out at the garden. The lemon tree was right there, beyond the glass. He said, without turning, "Your father planted that?" "My mother did," she said. "He just tended it." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's a good tree." "It's not a very productive tree," she said. "The lemons are quite small and a bit sour." "I like it," he said. "So do I," she said. He handed her the tea. She took it and stood beside him, and they looked at the tree together. The garden was brown and bare and still, but the tree was there. It had been there for years and it had been tended and it would be there in spring, green and particular and slightly sour and entirely itself. She thought about the plans she had made, the ground floor room with the garden access, the good light, the space for flowers and small celebrations. She thought about what it would look like with the right table in it and the right arrangement on the table, and the particular smell of fresh flowers filling a room that had been closed and still for too long. She thought about the business, how it might grow, here, in a space that was hers to shape. She said to Owen, "I want to take in one wall and open it to the garden." He said, "Which wall?" She pointed. He looked at it. "That's a supporting wall." "I know. I'd need someone to look at it properly. My brother's friend does structural work," he said. "I'll ask." She leaned against him slightly. He put his arm around her shoulder. The kitchen was warm, the tea was right, the tree was in the garden. She thought about the solicitor, Dr. Kunze, who had been direct and efficient and had treated Alara's situation with the straightforward seriousness it deserved. She thought about Frau Heller in the consignment shop, who had been kind and honest and had shown her the receipt without being asked. She thought about Clara, who arrived to work slightly breathless and half-eaten roll in hand, and who was better with customers than Alara was, and therefore indispensable. She thought about the small shop in the 5th District and the woman named Clara who had put the dress on a rolling rack and found the right one in 3 tries. She thought about Francis, pressing the dress at midnight and bringing it over by morning, no fuss. She thought about Greta at the Hofburg, her cane and her sharp memory and the garden party and the red dress and the strawberries. She thought about Helena, the note written in clear handwriting, and the box arriving on a Wednesday. She thought about her father, at a garden party, holding her small hand, being proud of a name he could not fully explain. She thought about all the people who had moved through the recent months of her life with grace and kindness and ordinary human decency, and she thought about how much of what had happened had depended on that, not on luck exactly, not on fairness exactly, but on the accumulation of decent people doing decent things at the right moments, often without knowing they were doing anything important at all. She said, "I want to have Nadia for dinner this week." "Yes," Owen said. "And your mother?" "Absolutely. And Frau Heller from the consignment shop if she'd come." He looked at her. She said, "She was kind to me. She deserves a meal." He said, "Then invite her." She thought about it, and Frau Adler from the original bridal boutique, though that might be too many people for the kitchen table. "We'll get a bigger table," he said simply. She smiled. He finished his tea. He set the mug down on the counter in the specific place that was beginning to be his specific place, a small and meaningful thing. She looked around the kitchen, her father's house, her house, their house. There was a great deal to do. There was the structural wall to assess and the garden to be planned for spring, and the plans for the studio space to be drawn up properly, and then costed, and then budgeted, and then actioned in the order that things can be actioned, when the money is modest and the patience is real. There was the second formal gala invitation that would come next October. There was the family record she was now a part of. There was the growing acquaintance with Maximilian Voss Hartmann, who poured his own tea and asked the right questions, who had become, in an unexpected and quiet way, simply a person she knew. There was the lemon tree that needed tending in the spring. There was the loose board on the 3rd step. There was the brass number plate on the door. All of it was hers. She set down her own mug and walked to the window and put her hand on the glass, as she had done months ago from a different window in a different room, and she looked at the garden, the winter garden with its bare branches and its waiting soil and its one impractical lemon tree, and she thought about what it meant to begin. Not to have arrived, not to have finished, just to begin. She had thought, once, that the life she wanted was something she had to get to, that it was ahead of her, waiting, contingent on some condition being met, some obstacle cleared, some permission granted. She had spent years being careful and patient and quiet in a house that made her feel like a visitor in her own story. But it had not been ahead of her. It had been happening all along. The flowers she arranged every morning before anyone else was awake. The friendships she had kept with care and honesty. The love she had chosen with Owen on a Sunday in March in the wet grass. The name she had always carried and only recently understood. All of it had been accumulating, the way savings accumulate, slowly and then all at once, until one day you look at the number and it is enough to buy the dress. Or to lose the dress and find it again. She stepped back from the window. She turned around. Owen was looking at her from across the kitchen, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, his expression the warm and wondering one she had learned to love. She said, "What?" He said, "I was thinking that I'm glad I proposed under that tree." She said, "The chestnut tree. The wet grass and everything," he said. She crossed the kitchen and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into it, and they looked out at the garden together again. "The lemon tree needs pruning in February," she said. "I'll look that up," he said. "And the board on the 3rd step. Already have someone in mind." She said, "You planned this." "I am a planner," he said with dignity. She laughed. He was not, in any conventional sense, a planner. He was kind and steady and slightly scattered and enormously good, and she would spend a long time finding out what all of that meant, which was the whole point of the life they were building. The house was quiet around them. The garden waited in the dark. The story that had started with a garment bag missing from a closet, and a woman folding napkins with careful hands, and a number reported as 180 when it was 340, all of it led here. To a kitchen with a lemon tree visible through the glass and 2 mugs on the counter, and a husband made of goodness, and a name that turned out to be older than anyone had known, and a dress hung on a hook upstairs, returned and restored, and entirely hers. Elara had expected the life she wanted to arrive all at once, packaged and complete. Instead, it had come in pieces, some of them broken, some of them unexpected, some of them handed to her by strangers who would never know how much the gesture had mattered. She had simply kept going. She had kept her hands in the flowers and her eyes on the next thing and her friendships close and her love real and her name her own. She had been patient until patience cost too much, and then she had been clear. That was all. That was everything. In the spring, she would open the studio. In October, she would go to the gala. In February, she would prune the lemon tree. On some evening soon, she would have Nadia and Francis and Frau Heller to dinner at the kitchen table. And tomorrow morning, she would be at the shop before the light, when the flower crates arrived still damp and cool, and she would carry them in one by one, and sort the stems and fill the buckets and begin the work of the day, which was the work she loved, which was the work that was hers. She stood in her kitchen and looked at the garden. The lemon tree stood in the dark, slight and bare, and slightly sour, and entirely, absolutely, worth tending. She had expected the dress to be the beginning of something beautiful. She had not known then how right she was. She had only known that she was,